Not so long ago, a friend of mine and I were talking about the good old university days. And she said part of the reason that we were friends is because when we went out, I was always keen to get up and dance. She's right, I was, and I never thought anything of it. It didn't occur to me not to. There's music, let's dance. But clearly, some of her other friends were not so keen to dance. And as the years have gone by, I have noticed that lots of people are not inclined to dance in public. Remember pre-pandemic when socials were a Manitoba thing? Lots of people attend socials and never go near the dance floor. Pretty regularly, I invite people to dance along to a piece of music we play in church. Hardly anyone ever does. Even I, who was ready to get up and dance, find that I am much more cautious about it now. I don't always dance, even when I might like to. I'm worried about the eye rolls. I'm afraid of what people might think or say. I assume people might judge me negatively. And that's the thing about cynicism. It makes us assume the worst. I feel like that's where many of us are at in the pandemic at this point, completely jaded about the rules and the leadership and how, if ever, we're going to get out of this thing. We assume that nobody knows what they're talking about. We don't trust that people are making the best decisions for the best reasons, but rather are acting in their own self-interests, whatever they may be. It's not just the pandemic, though, is it? There are lots of reasons why our experience tells us to be cynical. We get more scam phone calls than any other kind these days. So why would we answer the phone now, or answer the door, or respond to something online without suspicion that the person on the other end wants something from us? There seems to be little consequence to public figures and politicians for telling lies. It's just part of a system that elections will promise things that will never come to pass. And we've all seen politicians who will say anything at all to get what they want, even as they accuse others of lying. We've seen manipulation of every kind in order to get support for a particular position. We can understand why some question the value of voting at all. There is both visible and hidden bias in much of our media. There's rampant misinformation on social media. So why would we trust anything we read? Why wouldn't we be skeptical of what we hear? The truth is, we do need to be skeptical and discerning. We know we need to be careful. We know how easy it is to be taken advantage of. And we know that people do lie and cheat and steal. And sometimes it's just easier to assume the worst before we experience the worst. Forget the grain of salt, we'll take everything with a load of salt. Because we assume that cynicism will protect us from looking foolish, from being taken advantage of. We assume that cynicism will shield us from the pain of betrayal and disappointment that we will feel if our trust is broken, and broken again, and broken again. Fool me once, we say. Cynicism is like a shield that keeps people away, and we assume will keep the worst of the pain away. After all, if we assume the worst of everyone and everything, we can't be disappointed. And then if we turn out to be right about it, we can at least feel a little smug and superior, which can be a little boost to the ego to soften the blow. Yeah, that's what we think cynicism will do for us. Brené Brown used to start speaking engagements by showing a happy scene of people in a car and saying, "What do you think happens next?" What do you suppose? Now, 60% of the time, what people think will happen next is a car crash. Another 15 to 20% suggest something tragic, but they're a little more creative about it. They say, oh, there's a serial killer around the next bend. Oh, they don't know that there's a shark attack next. But in any case, 80% of the people predict tragedy. A tragedy much worse than a flat tire. And she suggests that our response to this question is just a symptom of the fact that we've created a world where an experience of joy, happy people in a car, tells us something terrible is coming. We can't even experience the joy because joy is foreboding. Joy is a trigger for pain to come. Cynicism leaps right into our joy and tells us if we rehearse the possible tragedy, it will make it easier when something bad comes. But it turns out, cynicism doesn't actually do what we think it will do. Cynicism doesn't actually do what we want it to do. Because when the worst does happen to us, we discover that our cynicism didn't protect us and didn't prevent the pain at all. It prevents us from feeling all sorts of other things, including good things. And we find that we are often sorry that we didn't embrace the joy when we had the chance. And while healthy skepticism can help us figure out who and what to trust, what cynicism does is encourage us to be bitter and sarcastic. Because cynical people tend to hold back from engaging with the world. They contribute less to the world. They isolate themselves, which interestingly kind of predisposes them to depression and a whole host of other negative health outcomes. Their cynicism almost becomes self-fulfilling. By always assuming the worst about everyone, they tend to bring it out, and not least perhaps in themselves. It's not the goal, but it's what happens. I don't know about you, but I watch that happen around me a lot these days. Around me and sometimes within me. Today, our Bible story presents us with a person who has every reason to be cynical. She's young and poor and unmarried, and it turns out, pregnant. She has every reason to believe that the world has it out for her. She has every reason to question people's motives and distrust any notions of human goodness and sincerity. And then she has this visitation by a messenger from God. She's perplexed, we're told, with good reason. She questions what she's being told. How can this be? But Mary is described in ways that suggest she's not unsophisticated. She's not naive. In fact, the traditions around Mary suggest that she was clever. She was thoughtful. Google fine art depictions of her sometime. And if you see Annunciation or other things with Mary, you'll often see her depicted with a book in her hand, so that we don't assume that she is ignorant or unthinking. But neither is she cynical. At the end of our reading today, we hear her choose to trust the message she's been given, choose to participate willingly in this divine calling to be the mother of Jesus. And as we continue to follow her story, even as her pregnancy becomes known to those around her, and the consequences to her remain, well, unclear at best and disastrous at worst, she follows the tradition of her faith ancestor, Hannah, and she sings a song of joy. Today we call that the Magnificat. Sometimes we call it the Canticle of Mary. We sang some of it earlier in that Janet Godesky hymn from More Voices. Then she spoke, rejoicing in her Savior. She spoke of justice for the poor. She spoke that kings oppress no more. When she spoke that dreaming Mary. Regardless of the day-to-day turmoil and tragedy, Mary found a way to say yes. She found a way to experience joy. And this season, we celebrate the birth of her son, the birth of one whom we call good news of great joy for all the people. And yet, I wonder if we will experience joy this Christmas. Are we capable of finding joy in this cynical time, in this cynical world? It's a tall order these days. We have to reach out to find people in whom we're willing to place our trust. But I noticed that Mary might have given us a clue about how to do that in the response that she gives in her story. She says, "Let it be as you have said." In essence, what she says is, yes. Comedian Stephen Colbert, host of The Late Show on CBS, he talks a lot about how much he has been formed by the yes and rule of improv comedy. See, to build a scene, you have to accept what someone else on stage gives you, and then you add to it. We are doctors. Yes, we are doctors. And we are in a mine. In a commencement address at a university, he once said this: "Now, will saying yes get you in trouble at times? Will saying yes lead you to doing some foolish things? Yes, it will. But don't be afraid to be a fool. Remember, you can't be both young and wise. And young people who pretend to be wise to the ways of the world are mostly just cynics. Cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but it's the furthest thing from it. Because cynics don't learn anything. Cynicism is a self-imposed blindness, a rejection of the world because we're afraid it will hurt or disappoint us. Cynics always say no, but saying yes begins things. Saying yes is how things grow. Saying yes leads to knowledge. So for as long as you have the strength to, say yes. Mary said yes. And if we wish to stem the tide of cynicism within us, as long as we have the strength to, we are encouraged to say yes. There's something else we can do too. What if we were to set about to be people worthy of trust? Instead of being another proof that everyone is dishonest and disingenuous and out for themselves, what if we were to be an example of someone who wasn't? What if we could be the reason that someone might believe that good people exist, that good things can happen? Some of you might remember a time Greg Cochran, former treasurer here, was asked about what he valued about this church. And he hearkened back to one of the first meetings he ever attended. He came to the church meeting, but in order to be able to attend, he had to bring his kids with him. And his experience with his friends and his colleagues prepared him to be ready for the sarcastic comments whispered about his parenting, or whether or not his kids would be there or should be there, and whether they'd be quiet. He expected a few eye rolls behind the forced smiles when asking about accommodations for their presence. And instead, he was rather shocked to discover among the group what he described as a complete lack of cynicism, simply sincere kindness. The group seemed genuinely glad to welcome him and his children exactly as they were. Now, the group meeting that night had no idea that they'd done anything special at all. They had no idea that they had instilled faith in a place where cynicism had been. So, in a cynical world, we have the choice to be kind. In a cynical world, we have the choice to be brave, to allow ourselves the vulnerability of experiencing delight. I've heard it said, for example, that we should dance like nobody is watching. But now I'm thinking that we should dance like somebody is watching, somebody who would also really like to dance, but they're afraid, or they don't want to look foolish, or they just don't want to be the only one. May God lift us from the blinders of cynicism, giving us wisdom to see things as they truly are. And then, may God give us the grace to open ourselves to people and opportunities around us, so that through our yes, the world may have access to joy. Amen.